fuzzy. It's like if you got the web, you can get on, you know.
Gotcha. I'm not familiar with it. I'll have to see what it's about.
Well, yeah. So yeah. So it's just it's kind of like a PowerPoint that's always online.
Gotcha.
And I noticed at the U, my students, freshmen, were using it. I'm like, what? They must know something I don't know. Let me see. Again. Um, so they've changed to another format. So like some of my presentations are on the old one.
Oh, gotcha.
So this is just it. So if it has, yeah, it should just pull up.
Okay, great.
Just like a PowerPoint.
As this full screened here or something. Okay.
Oh, my pleasure. So you usually have an event like this in November?
Yes. Mary's for the Boston.
Uh-huh. Good.
Would you like? Are you going to be doing any walking around, or are you going to stay right on this? Because I have this microphone. I also have handheld or loud.
Maybe put that on me just in case, because sometimes you do questions and you end up moving.
Yeah. So I'll have you flip this to. You can put it in your pocket or anywhere else.
I have.
Yep, exactly. And then this we can pin right here.
Okay.
I can do that.
Sure.
Okay.
Mhm.
Won't you just talk a little bit?
Am I being picked up? Okay.
How is that with videography? How was that? Was that okay?
A little more. Oh, would you speak a little more for his sound check?
Can you hear me on the sound check? Do I sound okay?
Just keep talking.
My talk is New Directions in the History of American Indian Education. Okay.
Okay, great.
All right.
Ready when you are.
Super. Okay. So, yeah, it's 5 till.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, I did ask Brenda if that was okay.
Let's see. Would you mind showing me that mic back? I need to see which number I gave you.
This one? Maybe. Oh. Okay.
In the audience who comes to every presentation we do on native issues.
Uh-huh.
Who's kind of in the middle,
Sure.
red and black,
Okay.
older man,
Okay.
anti-treaty,
Okay.
big time. And every once in a while they brought a question that is just like,
Off the wall.
yeah, and just nasty. So
Okay.
I said to Steve, I just wanted to just kind of alert you.
I might do.
He
Yeah.
behaves most of the time, but every once in a while it's like,
Yeah. Once in a while, we get quirky people at the university too, so I'll just thank him for his question or whatever if I can't answer it. Okay. Okay. Do you hear that? Okay.
If you have that on, if you have it, if you want to turn it on,
you need to meditate.
so you can just have it off.
We'll just take another minute and then we'll get started. So if you could have a seat. If you're here for Spanish classes, there is a clipboard down here to sign in. Thank you.
While they're still coming in their classes. It looks like maybe. Do you have Indian Studies classes?
It does look like. I don't know if that's Charles' class or whose class that is.
What is that class?
Oh, I wonder if we've got a visiting school. I think that's what we have here.
Cool. Where are they from, I wonder?
Thank you for coming today. I'm Tracy Jimenez, and I'm the coordinator for Cultural Thursday. And today we have Dr. Brenda Child, who is a professor and chair of the Department of American Studies and former chair of American Indian Studies at the University of Minnesota. She received her PhD in history at the University of Iowa. Her first book, Boarding School Seasons, American Indian Families from 1900 to 1940, won the North American Indian Prose Award. Child's newest books are Holding Our World Together, Ojibwe Women and the Survival of Community, and Indian Subjects, Hemispheric Perspectives on the History of Indigenous Education. Dr. Child is a trustee of the National Museum of the American Indian Smithsonian. She serves on the Repatriation Committee, the Executive Committee, and chairs the Scholarship and Collections Committee. She's also a trustee of the Minnesota Historical Society. At the University of Minnesota, she was a recipient of the President's Award for Outstanding Community Service and is co-founder of a major digital humanities project. This is what I'm excited about because I'm a linguist. So the Ojibwe People's Dictionary, which launched as a website in 2012. Dr. Child was born on the Red Lake Ojibwe Reservation in northern Minnesota, where she's a citizen and member of a community writing a new constitution for the nation of 11,900. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Brenda Child.
If there's any, so press video to return. Is there something I need to do to the screen?
George. George. We've lost the Prezi.
It's funny though that if you can get it out, I can talk without it.
Okay.
So can you all hear me just with the mic like this? Okay, great. I had a few photographs to show you, but everything will be just fine, even if it doesn't work. What do you think, George? Is it gonna? Okay. Well, thanks for inviting me here today. I'm really happy to be with you all. As Tracy mentions, I teach history at the University of Minnesota, and I have been doing work on boarding school history for quite a long time. It really was some of the earliest research that I did when I was in graduate school, and I've been kind of following this kind of line trajectory of research for a long time. So I'm going to introduce a few ideas about boarding school history, and I'll talk for a while, and then after a while I'll give you a chance to ask questions if you'd like. But just to start out and to kind of warm up, let me say that in thinking about boarding school history, if we sort of take a broad look at this subject and we look at it through the lens of our kind of racial past in the United States, boarding schools have never really been acknowledged as part of our legacy of segregated schooling. And for the most part, it's been a history that has largely been ignored by American historians. And segregation, is a word that looms very large when we think about the history of education in the United States. Most of us know about Brown versus the Board of Education and stories about integrating public schools in the United States and the sort of struggles that African Americans had. But very few people have heard about some of the early legal cases where American Indians were involved in petitioning to attend public schools and that sort of history. So I'm going to encourage you today to kind of think about a little bit this idea of segregation, which we don't usually apply to thinking about the boarding school era. There are words that we use like assimilation, cultural assimilation. When looking at it from the perspective of Native people, we talk about cultural genocide and that kind of thing. But we don't usually use this word segregation. But that's the one I kind of want to focus on with you today. Because boarding schools were kind of a unique form of segregated education to emerge in the history of the United States. And like other forms of segregation, of course, it would serve the interests of the majority culture. So at the time the boarding schools were first designed, reformers and politicians agreed that Indian men, women, and children, but especially children, must adopt values of individualism. They must become citizens of the United States. Many Indians were not citizens in the late 19th century. And they should change the way they worked, especially. That was a real focus of the boarding schools, that they should pursue a kind of agricultural labor or perhaps even industrial labor. And this assessment of Indian societies or indigenous societies at the time was politically motivated. And when I ask, students or others in the public to kind of think about this history of boarding school education, it's very important to remember that we not get caught up so much in the rhetoric of what people in the late 19th century were saying they wanted to have happen, or the ways they wanted Indian societies to evolve, or how they wanted them to change. Because when I think about that political rhetoric of the late 19th century, it really was about politically motivated, that rhetoric. And what was going on in the United States in the late 19th century is that policymakers and people in Washington wanted to get their hands on land that Indian people were still in possession of. So this is even after the treaty period, right, of when a lot of tribes like those here in Minnesota negotiated treaties in the late 19th century. But in the 1880s, people in Washington kind of looked across the United States, and they could still see that Native people were in possession of a lot of lands and a lot of resources. And there was a lot of interest in the lands that Indian people were still in possession of. And this is really what's behind the boarding school history. Okay. Anyway, this, as I say, it was kind of a politically motivated policy at the time, and it was really about privatizing Indian land. So what that meant was, in the United States, there was this policy passed, legislation, very big legislation passed in the late 19th century called the Dawes Allotment Act, and it happened in 1887. And there was also a particular legislation in Minnesota that we usually call the Nelson Act that was passed just a couple of years later. And it was all about the same thing. It was all about how to privatize Indian land, which meant that some of that land that Native people owned and were still in possession of as kind of tribally held lands, that land could enter the public domain. And in fact, that's what the Dawes Act and the Nelson Act in effect did, so that the reservations were kind of carved up, divided up into individual allotments that would be privately held, and there would no longer be this kind of large tribal land base anymore. And even with the carving up of reservations and the taking of allotments, there was generally land that was left over, and this land was to kind of enter into the public domain, and it would be available to homesteaders. So that land would sort of pass out of Indian ownership at the time. So in thinking about this era then, and I usually think about the boarding school era as being a 50-year period from the late 19th to the early 20th century. And it's important to remember that Indians, just like African Americans, were first taught to read and to write in segregated schools. And this system was upheld in the United States until the educational and political reforms of the 1930s began to lead toward public school education. So the power of segregation, a term we don't usually apply to thinking about American Indian history, was very powerful. It was a very powerful notion in thinking about Indian people and what kind of education they should have in the late 19th and the early 20th century. So when we think about boarding school history, we usually kind of date it from a period that is actually the end of the Indian Wars, right? That in the late 19th century, a lot of tribes were involved in actually military conflict with the United States to the extent that wars were taking place, especially on the northern plains and the southern plains. And it's kind of in this atmosphere that the boarding school kind of policies are being designed at the early reservation years. And so for about 50 years, you want to think of it as the policy that kind of dominates Indian, relationships with Indian tribes in the United States for about 50 years, so for about a half century. So it's the late 19th century, and the early schools that were established, one of them was called Carlisle in Pennsylvania. It was a school my own great-grandfather attended in the early 20th century. And then there were other schools that kind of followed in the West. Here in the Midwest, there were schools, and then in areas all the way out to California and the Northwest, there were boarding schools that were established for Indians at the time. So Indians went to boarding schools, to off-reservation schools. They went into segregated schools. And this was a very kind of powerful influence in Native people's lives for about a half century. Since the publication of my first book, which is called Boarding School Seasons, I was going to show you the nice cover of my early book, subtitled American Indian Families, 1900 to 1940, I've continued to puzzle over the history of Indian education in the United States. Indian education is kind of very interesting to me because it held some very distinctive features, while there were other qualities that were shared with other ethnic minorities in the United States. So in a sense, it was sort of a unique thing for Indians, but then there were other things, aspects of their education that was shared with other ethnic minorities. And even when we look at it now, which we've been increasingly doing from a global perspective, we see that there are many qualities that Indian education in the U.S. during the boarding school era had in common with other countries. I was just reading and learning from a scholar who does work in Hawaiian history, and she was pointing out that some of the same missionaries who came to the Hampton Institute, which many of you know was an early black school in Virginia that Indians also attended in the 19th and the early 20th century, that the same missionaries who were active at the Hampton Institute in Virginia were also active in the colonization of Hawaii and spreading their message of missionization, Christianization, and education. So there's a lot that we as Native people have in common with other indigenous peoples, especially because we are subject to the same ideas and influences that were being kind of spread around the world. Maori people in New Zealand were also subject to a boarding school system that operated for a long time, even though it kind of unfolded in different ways than the boarding schools in the United States. There were also residential schools in Canada. They're quite interesting to me because actually the boarding school system lasted a lot longer in Canada than it did in the United States. So whereas someone my age might associate more with my grandparents' generation or even my great-grandfather who was a student at Carlisle, people my age in Canada often attended residential schools. And so that's why there's been kind of a big public conversation in Canada about residential school history, because in fact that history is much more recent in Canada than it is in the United States. So, and some of you also, I always recommend that wonderful Australian film, Rabbit Proof Fence, which talks about what they call in Indigenous Australia the stolen generation, because there were Aboriginal people were also subject to some of these same ideas and policies, although it went to kind of even greater lengths in Australia. So what is unique in the U.S. context then, somewhat unique, not entirely unique, is that segregation in Indian education was sort of inextricably linked to these land policies of the late 19th century. So the United States was kind of exploiting Indian lands for the benefit of the broader citizens of the United States. And this coincides with the boarding school era. So we have to look at these policies of land allotment, the privatization of Indian land, which resulted in a further dispossession of Indians for this half century, as being very tied up and connected with boarding school education. We can't really think of one of these policies and experiences without the other. They're very, very linked, and they're linked in time. It all coincided. It's interesting to me to think about how education was sort of upheld in the United States as a kind of compensation for Indians. There was a kind of general acknowledgement that Indians were going to lose a lot of their land through the allotment policy. But they were being promised citizenship, they were being promised Christianity, and at the time, it was, being strongly argued that Native people needed to kind of give up the way of life that they had lived on reservations. And the conversation was all about integrating Indian people into the mainstream of American society and having them kind of enter American society on the same foothold as other Americans, that they would need new kinds of work in order to do so. But I always think how convoluted this argument is, and which is why I suggest to you we want to get beyond the rhetoric of just assimilation and trying to change Indians. Because what's really behind this whole notion of segregating Indians into these off-reservation government boarding schools, if really integration is to be the end result, right? It never makes sense. It's kind of a crazy policy if you think about it, because the United States government in the late 19th century would develop this very elaborate system of off-reservation boarding schools. I mentioned that Carlisle was one of the first schools. It was started in the East by this military man who had been involved in the Indian Wars. And then that was sort of the model of all these other schools that would develop in what historians always call the Trans-Mississippi West, right? That would mean like where we are now, even though we're very close to the Mississippi River, but in areas kind of Indian country, because Indian people were being increasingly moved farther west throughout the course of the 19th century. And so the schools, the way that we're to operate is that kids, and this was the notion of the school, how kind of educators imagined them, even though in practice they differed from this. But the idea was to take kids once they had reached the age about 12 years old, and they already knew how, it had already received at home a kind of basic primary education. That is, they could speak English, they could do math, they could do a little reading and that sort of thing. And at that point, they would go to these off-reservation boarding schools. And the idea was to take children at some distance from their home and have them go to school for usually the term of study was 4 years. And in the early years of government boarding schools, kids weren't supposed to come home and see their families during that time. Can you imagine, like, children that age going away for years at a time without seeing their family? And it really was at the discretion of people who ran the schools if children ever came home in those intervening years. And so from reading hundreds and hundreds of Indian people's letters in government archives, which I did to kind of work on my project, I would see that parents were always writing to the school. They always wanted their children to come home, and they were giving what they thought were very compelling reasons for them to come home, like there's a death in the family, or they have a sibling that's very ill, or they need to, anyway, a whole range of reasons that Indian people thought were very good and logical reasons for children to come home from school, but it was at the discretion of the people who ran the school whether they would come home or not. And so often those weren't very good excuses to school superintendents who could deny the parents the right to see their children. And so during the boarding school era, you have to think too about how parents kind of lost control over being the authority over their children, right? That basic things that we expect of relationships between parents and their roles within the family were they were kind of being disempowered by the government boarding schools at the time. And this would be the way things operated for many decades. And it wasn't really until the 1930s when Roosevelt was president of the United States and the boarding school era was beginning to decline that people began to see the usefulness of children spending time with their parents. And I mentioned that 12-year-old thing as being the policymakers at the time imagined that kids would be about 12 before they went to a government boarding school. But in fact, because in lots of regions where Indian people lived across the United States, they often were in some very rural areas, and that infrastructure didn't exist on reservations or in nearby communities for them to attend school till they were 12 years old. So in many cases, especially early in the government boarding school era, kids went off to boarding school at a young age. And many of the boarding schools had kindergartens. In fact, the picture that I have on the cover of my book, Boarding School Seasons, is from the Haskell School in Kansas, and it shows the kindergarten class of little children who were about 5 years old who were attending the off-reservation schools. So, again, back to my question, why segregate Indians then if integration is really the goal? And teaching Indian history with college students, I often say, so why did the government do this? What a crazy idea it is to have this elaborate system of off-reservation boarding schools for Indian children. And again, their response, having read the literature and being familiar with the ideas, they say assimilation is what the federal government is trying to do. And that's the project that you hear voiced again and again by policymakers, reformers, and missionaries who were pretty much unanimous in their idea that this was the best thing for American Indians at the time. So the next logical question then, when I ask students, and I do teach classes from time to time on the history of Indian education at the University of Minnesota, I say, why wasn't there a similar call in the United States for German boarding schools or Chinese boarding schools or something? Because in the 19th century, the United States was interested in assimilating many, many different kinds of people into American society. They thought that everyone should be Protestant, that they should speak English and that kind of thing, no matter where you're coming to the United States from. But we have to kind of look, as I say, and I'm suggesting to you, beyond the rhetoric, that it's more than about American life. It's more than about citizenship. It's more than about acquiring English language skills. It's really about the acquisition of Indian land, if we look behind what this policy was all about. So assimilation alone, I would suggest to you, can't account for the presence of Indian boarding schools for over a half century in the United States. And the reality was, at that time the schools were created, Indian properties and Indian assets were still at stake, and a campaign, it's often called the campaign for assimilation, in fact, by the policymakers at the time. There was a campaign, but the campaign was for Indian land and resources. And that battle was sort of waged every day of the boarding school era for the next 50 years. It was an era of a very big land grab in the United States. And so the rhetoric of assimilation is not just what produced boarding schools, but it was this desire on the part of the United States to expand and own more of the territories and the resources that Indian people were in possession of. So I'm asking you to think then about this idea of segregation and using that as a kind of tool, an analytic tool for thinking about the boarding school era. But there's another idea that took me a long time to figure it out, but hopefully I'll be able to have a few shortcuts for you in explaining this idea. But I think along the road to kind of looking at the history of education over the years, what I began to understand as well, and especially in my book, Boarding School Seasons, I took a lot of care to write about the, the decade of the 1930s, because I could see that it had some very distinctive qualities in the history of Indian education. And that in the 1930s, this was sort of shocking to me, but when I was in the government archives, I found that there were hundreds and hundreds of letters from Indian people asking to send their children to off-reservation boarding schools. They were begging superintendents to please take my child, please take my child. And I thought, what do I make of this, right? That this is an institution that I thought Native people sometimes loathed, that Native people certainly had a very conflicted relationship with at the minimum. What do I make of all these letters from Indian parents in the 1930s asking to enroll their children in these off-reservation boarding schools? And it was through reading all those letters and people explaining their family circumstances that I understood that these letters were really more about the Great Depression and how that unfolded in Indian country than it was about Indian people finally, becoming accustomed to boarding schools. So parents were writing about their poverty. There were letters from men and women who had lost their husband or wife to an illness and were unemployed. And so during the 1930s, Indian people began using government boarding schools as a kind of poverty relief program for relief during some of the worst miseries of the Great Depression. So that was something that I figured out. But along with figuring out that story of the 1930s, and remember what I was sort of up against in trying to insist that the 1930s was a very kind of important decade in the history of Indian education, there were scholars who came before me who said, nah, policymakers had changed their ideas about Indian education and public school starts to dominate. That's the big story, really, of Indian education after FDR in the 1930s. And so I had to kind of disagree with some of these other scholars who had kind of done their analysis and said boarding schools were sort of on their way out. Because if you look at boarding school history from the perspective of Native families, the 1930s is a very, very important era in boarding school history. But it's more about the poverty Indian people were experiencing during the Great Depression than it really was about the forced assimilation or acculturation policies kind of stemming from policies of the United States. So my big realization, and the other word I want you to kind of think about, is that we really should look at boarding school history as generational. That there were, even though it's kind of this half century that I'm describing to you where it dominates federal policy making toward Indians, the experiences of Native people different according to the decade or the era that they attended government schools. And this is a reason why boarding schools, one of the reasons why Indian boarding school experiences differed so widely. I know when I was started to do some of my research on government boarding schools when I was in graduate school during the 1980s, there were still people at home at Red Lake who had gone to boarding school in the 1930s and a little bit earlier, right? Now most of those people have kind of passed away. Almost everybody has passed away from that era. But I talked to some of those folks about their experiences, and I could see at the time, but didn't really understand why there were so many different ideas that people had about their boarding school experience. But I think if we use this idea of boarding school generations, and we look at this history in a generational way, we can see that Indian students would be very influenced by the times in which they attended school. And I often think of some of the figures that are very important in Indian history as an early generation of writers and thinkers who attended government boarding schools. People like Luther Standing Bear, the Lakota Man, Sun Elk, who was a man from Taos Pueblo who attended Carlisle, Charles Eastman, the Dakota writer from Minnesota, who he was also a physician whose family was very affected by the Dakota War, and he went off to the Genoa boarding school in Nebraska. And then there were others of this first generation of Indian people who arrived at Carlisle or Haskell or similar institutions. And when they showed up at these places to get their uniforms and their haircuts, which I would have showed you today, you would see that their experience is kind of coinciding with the era of the end of the Indian Wars. And many of them, Lakotas, Dakotas, Apaches, they were from communities that were actively engaged in military resistance against the United States. And so I would suggest to you that their experience, people like Charles Eastman, who was a child during the Dakota War, whose father converted to Christianity in an effort to kind of stay in Minnesota and survive here when Indian people were being sent to reservations out of Minnesota, or they were being sent to prison in Davenport, Iowa. Many of you know of the mass hanging in Mankato in the 1860s. This is the background to Charles Eastman's boarding school story. It's not entirely the same experience as later generations of people. And the Apaches who were held as prisoners of war down at Fort Marion in Florida, their children were the first kids to attend the Carlisle boarding school. They had been involved in warfare against the United States, and the government came in, took their children, and they were among the early boarding school students at Carlisle. Now, that experience of war and the background to this first generation of boarding school students is somewhat unique. It's not the same thing that people are experiencing in the early 20th century. So, even though subsequent generations of students may have attended a mission or a day school, maybe some of them were bilingual, or they were from families who had worked in the wage economy, we also have to think of a lot of Native people as being makers of what some have called an Indian New World in education. The early Carlisle and Haskell generation attended school at the height of the assimilation campaign and at the end of the military conflict. I've recently become very intrigued by the American Indian generation who lived through the First World War and the people who survived the influenza epidemic of 1918-19. That, if you've never heard of the flu epidemic, it was a huge global event that killed more people globally than the First World War. That was, the influenza was a terrible thing at a lot of the off-reservation boarding schools. But this global epidemic of influenza contributed to high death rates for Indian people who were in boarding school at the time. And it was no doubt a very traumatic effect had a very traumatic impact on these particular students at the time. And that flu was sort of unusual in that it killed young people rather than older people. And so you can imagine going through school, living very closely with students. Many students died from that experience. And so that's a somewhat unique time in the boarding school history. I have a wonderful colleague named John Troutman who wrote this book that I like a lot called Indian Blues, American Indians and the Politics of Music. And he looks at the boarding school era from 1879 to 1934. And what John has suggested is that this era of World War I kind of produced a different set of tactics and ideas than those promoted by the early generation of Carlisle graduates and other members of this organization called the Society of American Indians that I won't go into. But they're an interesting group of kind of early reform group of Native intellectuals in the United States who formed an organization in 1911, and Charles Eastman was a member of that. But studying this interesting and somewhat eclectic group of boarding school graduates who became professional musicians, there were many people who became musicians out of boarding school. Troutman viewed this group as being self-consciously modern American Indians who were, in his words, creating new traditions, while publicly asserting that Indians must claim a voice and a leadership in their own affairs. So what scholars like John Troutman have suggested then is that this World War I generation has some unique aspects. And they came out of boarding school. They were not like the first, so much like the first generation of people who'd lived through and survived the Indian Wars, but they were the World War I generation. The other thing I always think about the World War I generation, they were the first to enlist directly into the military from government boarding schools, which began a new trend in what some refer to as patriotism, directly related to, I think of it as being directly related to American colonialism that was inherent in the federal boarding school system as well, because Indian kids were in essentially military schools. They were already attending military school when they were in Carlisle or Haskell or a number of these other off-reservation boarding schools. They marched around in military patterns. They wore uniforms. Often there were old military people who ran the schools. They were already in military schools at the time of the First World War. And they joined up. They came in and recruited Indians directly out of government boarding schools during World War I. And rates of Indian people going into the military were much higher out of Indian boarding schools than reservation communities, right? So in a sense, we have to look at that World War I generation as being very connected up to the kind of military history of American Indians as well. What else? I'll just mention one last thing and then kind of see if you all have some questions. And that is, so the generations I'm kind of suggesting to you, think about that early generation of people who survived the Indian Wars as being somewhat unique. Particular qualities to the World War I generation who were living through the First World War. And then there was kind of a new era in Indian education that began once public school education surpassed boarding schools as the foundation of U.S. Indian education. And this would happen in the 1930s. So in thinking about this era, it does come to an end, even though there were some schools, boarding schools, that persisted beyond the 1930s. They did so with different policies and different people who ran them and operated them than the previous 50 years. So if we really look at the history of Indian education in the 20th century, the big story that emerges for Indians is public school education. We haven't studied that as much as we should as scholars and historians, but that's the big story. So since FDR and since this really kind of big innovator and progressive educators who came to be involved in Indian education at that time, people like Carson Ryan, there really was a switch to public school education. And so since FDR, it's really been public school. That's been the big story for Indian people. But I would suggest to you that this story that I saw in the boarding school records about the Great Depression makes that experience somewhat unique because it was a kind of, I'm suggesting to you, a kind of poverty relief program for Indians during the 1930s. And there was kind of a unique quality to the boarding school generation who were kind of forced into boarding school, but it really was to kind of offset the poverty of their families during the Great Depression. Because in the United States, people in the Indian office thought Indians should go to public schools. John Collier, who was a commissioner of Indian Affairs in the 1930s, referred to boarding schools as, he liked to call them medieval institutions. He closed them down. This is the great era during FDR when government boarding schools are being closed down. That's not to say that a few didn't continue. Flandreau in South Dakota, the Phoenix Indian School, there were some institutions that survived what you might think. There were some boarding schools that survived the boarding school era. But for the most part, it's the big move into public school after that time. So among American Indians today, who often single out boarding school as the institution most responsible for creating social problems for later generations, there isn't really a strong, what I often call and historians call historical memory of the notion that Indian people themselves repeatedly sought out schools for their children. But they did so not so much because they loved boarding school, but because it really was a strategy for them of family preservation. They had very few options, and especially that was true during the Great Depression. So boarding school history kind of, even during the Great Depression, demonstrates considerable Indian agency. And this is another point we have to remember, that Indian people, even though they weren't in very powerful positions during the boarding school era, and especially that half century, they always refused to act powerless. And this was true of even the youngest children in government boarding schools, because many of the letters that I read when I was doing my research was about rebellious kids, children, teenagers who hopped trains and left the schools. At Haskell in 1919, they had an event like this where a speaker came to campus. They cut off their new electricity. There was a rebellion. The kids tried to take over the boarding school. So it's always important for us to remember the agency of Native people and the ways in which families and students themselves put limits on the assimilative intentions of the institution. And I worry that to suggest otherwise underestimates American Indian families, especially as the historical record is so unambiguous in the way it demonstrates how they also, Indian people also shaped and defined the boarding school era. So I think I've talked long enough, and you've been really very patient. And I think I'll just see if you have any questions you'd like to ask about boarding school history, or a question you'd like to ask, or a point you'd like to make. Go ahead. Uh-huh. Well, gosh, I don't know if I can exactly answer that question really, really well. But although I did read year after year reports of superintendents, so typically the school year started out in the fall with hundreds of Indian students. The schools that I know best were Haskell in Lawrence, Kansas, and Flandreau in South Dakota, the school my grandmother attended, because I looked very carefully at their records, as well as Pipestone in Minnesota. And the attendance was pretty high in the fall. And then there would be this kind of attrition throughout the school year because so many kids ran away. And so these policies that I was talking about, where you don't go home and see your parents for 4 years, that didn't work for Indian people. And so the kids generally ran away from school, or they went home on their own, right? That they weren't going, imagine what that would be like to not see your child for years at a time, or for the child to be without their family or their community. And so generally we think of the schools as being, they were sort of in, rural towns of the United States, Flandreau, South Dakota, Lawrence, Kansas, maybe that was a bigger town. Chemawa, the boarding school in Oregon, there were a number of schools that were in Oklahoma, but they usually were not adjacent to Indian communities, which is how Flandreau was unusual, because there was an Indian community there. But the idea was to kind of get Native people away from, to set up the schools away from the reservations, so that kids wouldn't be going back and forth all the time, and that there would be this distance between the tribal communities and the children in the schools. Go ahead, in the back row. Uh-huh.
The model for the man that started Carlisle was Shelby Williams,
Mm-hmm.
there were so many atrocities that were going on to our native kids at the boarding school.
Mm-hmm.
My grandfather had car.
Yeah.
I mean, his feet were big in his language.
Right. Mm-hmm.
They couldn't practice their own spiritual beliefs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I think that's one thing that a lot of people don't understand. The historical the boarding school era is followed up by what is called the forced adoption era, where the counties come in and take the kids, farm the kids out to non-native homes. It has been going on for a long time, too long, of trying to make us white and fit into the society.
Mm-hmm.
And it just, I don't know,
Mm-hmm.
it seemed like we glossed over some of those facts. You know, I would like to see what the really was. I
Yeah.
mean, researching it is one thing,
Mm-hmm.
but knowing survivors of and knowing what they went through
Mm-hmm.
is something that everybody.
I appreciate your comments. And I was just thinking about, when I was doing the research for what became boarding school seasons, I tried to, kind of as much as I could, follow the, the stories of what Indian people were saying about boarding school. And what I used primarily as my sources were letters that Indian students and their family members wrote to one another. Sometimes I used the voices of superintendents because they often tell stories. Sometimes they were writing to parents, informing them that their children had died at school, or they were informing them about illnesses and other accidents and things that had happened to them at boarding school. So the way,
Never reached the kids.
yeah,
Their parents were right.
yeah,
Dennis Banks is an executive staff of that.
yeah,
But, you know,
mm-hmm,
he told that story over and over. How he lost the love from his mother because he thought he had abandoned her. She didn't write to him, nothing while he was in boarding school. And he found out years later when his daughter researched boarding school, a stack of letters with money in them, begging to send him home. His mother writing letters and never.
yeah.
That happened to so many in those years.
Mm-hmm. And at the same time, if you look at the boarding school records, there are hundreds and hundreds of letters, hundreds even in the where I was doing my research down in Kansas City at the National Archives, which were kind of basically the emptied out file cabinets from Haskell and Flandreau and the Pipestone schools. And so it is possible to read the voices of Indian mothers and fathers and extended family and children talking about their boarding school experiences. And so what you kind of see when you look at the letters is that there is sort of a continuum of Native people's experiences with government boarding schools, to children who didn't survive, to people who experienced ran away from school. There was a lot of resistance involved because they were obviously very unhappy and they didn't like the family separation, to people who thrived in government boarding schools and report that as well. And so one thing that you have to kind of, what you see is that there is this wide-ranging continuum of Native people's experiences during the boarding school era. Is there another, I think I have maybe time for one more or two more questions.
I was wondering what education is like now for.
Oh gosh, I think that you shouldn't ask a historian the question of how education is today, but I have a couple of notes on this topic because sometimes people ask me that. And one of the things that I'm always sort of aware of at the University of Minnesota when we think about our incoming students, or we're trying to involve students in, encouraging them to come to the university, I always think about the fact that there is this alarming achievement gap in Minnesota. And here we live in, one of the most prosperous states in the United States that prides itself and has for decades and decades on excellence in public schools and high achievement on standardized tests. Yet Indian children and youth still lag far behind the majority. Of course, there are incredible exceptions to this, and I want to mention my friend Melissa Boyd, who's here with me today from Mille Lacs, because one of the things that really inspires me and that we try to support at the University of Minnesota is the work going on around language immersion schools, so that Native people have found that often public schools are places where Indian people are, children are failing, and even sometimes within our reservation communities, we're failing at school, and many of those schools don't have curriculums that reflect Native history, Native culture. They're very out of tune with the communities. And so, so the new work that's been going on in language immersion, Melissa has been one of the formative preschool teachers at Mille Lacs with 3-year-olds. We're finding that it's much better to learn your language when you're a little tiny kid than it is when you're in college, an adult. And so that has been a really inspiring place to sort of see Native people taking charge of their own education, which isn't what the boarding school era is about at all, right? It's about the decline of culture. It's about Native languages and cultures being under attack. And so it's nice to see that as being a very bright spot, you know, in Indian education today. The Weduka Dotting School over in Wisconsin was started by a couple of our alumni of our language programs at the University of Minnesota. So when I think of inspiring places to kind of look at Indian education, I look at rebellious kids in the historical records, and then I look at this really amazing kind of network and, you know, this thing that's kind of going on around not just Indian country in the US, but it's also kind of a global movement. Hawaii and New Zealand have been leaders in kind of Native people reclaiming their native languages. And so I have colleagues that I see regularly in New Zealand. And so people my age in New Zealand who are Native often don't speak their tribal languages. Their parents did, but now their children do, right? And so that's been a really big revolution in New Zealand's education. So, okay, well, I know some of you have to go back to class, so thanks very much for coming to my talk today. I don't know why this thing wouldn't work. Isn't that the craziest thing? Well, sometimes it's like if you're really dependent on, you know, I'm going to